Peter, and said to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, Truly you are the Son of God. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, that would have been a very exciting night for the disciples, after a very exciting day as well, when Jesus fed over 5,000 people with 2 fish and 5 loaves. But I'm here to tell you that if I was in that boat that night, I would not have been afraid at seeing Jesus walk on the water, because I would not have seen him walk on the water. I would have been at the bottom of the boat, sick from the waves, and I say that on the testimony of my experience. So my favorite part of that story would have been when Jesus got and everything calmed down, and then I would have sat up and what's going on, And then we hear this great little line in the gospel. It says, those who were in the boat did him homage. And homage is not a word that we use very often, but what St. Matthew is trying to tell us is that the disciples fell on their knees to worship Jesus. That's what they did in that boat that night. And it's really important that these two things go together, worship and kneeling. They're inseparable because they are two aspects of one thing. One is external, one is internal. One is bodily, one is spiritual. With our spirits, we lift our hearts to God. And with our bodies, we make some sort of gesture to show that we are doing this. And so if we didn't have that interior worship, our external actions would be meaningless. It would be meaningless to kneel before God if we didn't actually worship him. And the opposite is also true. If we were to somehow think about worshiping him in a completely spiritual way, it would be unfitting for us because we are body and soul composites. Somebody gave the example of a house that's on fire. Inside the fire starts, but gradually it becomes, it's shown on the outside as well. And that's how it is in our souls. That our souls must overflow to our bodies. That way we make the gestures, the sign of the cross, bowing and genuflecting and kneeling and sitting and standing. All of these things, they're really important to help us to enter into that act of worship. And kneeling is a specifically Christian act. Before the time of Christ, the Greeks and the Romans rejected it. The famous philosopher Aristotle said that that's what barbarians do, is kneel down. And then again, the gods that they honored were not God. And so it was not fitting for them to fall on their knees before these false gods. Kneeling instead comes from the Bible and its knowledge of God. And so I'll give you a few examples from the New Testament. We hear about people going up to Jesus and falling on their knees. We hear again about the disciples in the boat falling on their knees. We hear that Jesus himself knelt on the night before he died in the garden, that St. Stephen knelt before his martyrdom. In the Acts of the Apostles, we also hear that St. Peter knelt, that St. Paul knelt, and that the community also knelt. And St. Paul tells us in the hymn in the letter to the Philippians that at the name of Jesus, every knee must bend. And then finally, in the book of Revelation, we hear it again and again, that they fell down in worship. And so it is really important. And we, of course, do this every time we come to Mass. We come in, we genuflect to our Eucharistic Lord before we enter our pews. And the priests and the servers, they also genuflect when we get to the sanctuary or during Mass. We also kneel at the important parts of Mass when the bread and the wine become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. We don't kneel at other times during the Mass, like during the homily or during the reading of the Scriptures. We could if we wanted to, but the most fitting time is when Jesus is truly present to us as he was to those disciples in the boat. And when we do this, when we kneel, we express our reverence and adoration. We acknowledge that God is great and that we are little. When we kneel, we lose at least a third of our height, maybe more if you slouch down, And so we make ourselves smaller. We make ourselves closer to the ground. And when we do this, we acknowledge that Jesus is Lord and I am not. We express also our belief in the true presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. It would be totally unfitting if we were to say, this is really Jesus, this is his body and blood, soul and divinity, and then we didn't kneel down when he was present to us. It wouldn't make any sense. Our actions would contradict our words. And so we have a couple little examples I'd like to share with you about the importance of kneeling. St. James, one of the apostles, he's called James the Lesser, the brother of Jude. He was the bishop of Jerusalem, and he knelt all the time, we are told, so much so that his knees became very callous. They call them like the knees of camels. His knees have been so thickened by all the time kneeling. And I guess it doesn't take too much, because my first year as a priest, when I had knee surgery, the surgeon told me that the skin on my knees was a little bit thicker than average because of kneeling. I bet now it's probably thinner than average because I don't kneel enough. But it's something that is important for us. Another example is something that Pope Benedict says in his book. He tells a story about this desert father who was praying, and the devil appeared to him. And he said the devil was, of course, hideous, and he was dark, and he had these really thin limbs. But the thing that he noticed most of all was that the devil didn't have any knees. He didn't have any knees. He couldn't kneel. And I told that once to the kids at the school mass. And then the rest of the day, I kind of laughed to look walking around, no knees. He'd be like a person on stilts, something kind of silly. And Pope Benedict says, the inability to kneel is seen as the very essence of the diabolical. And so it is necessary for Christian worship to kneel. And I just want to conclude by sharing a couple quotes from Pope Benedict once again. He says, the man who learns to believe learns also to kneel. When you learn to believe, you learn also to kneel. And then he goes on, a faith or a liturgy no longer familiar with kneeling would be sick at the core. If a faith or a liturgy that does not kneel is sick at its core, there's something truly wrong with it. If there's places where they discourage kneeling, or they take away kneelers, or never put them in, that's doing damage to the Christian community, because kneeling is very important. He goes on to say, where it has been lost, kneeling must be rediscovered, so that in our prayer we remain in fellowship with the apostles, like in the boat, and martyrs, indeed in union with Jesus Christ himself. So that's really important. One final thing he says is that when we are able to kneel for the Eucharist, then we can see other people in their need, and we can help them as well. This is what he says. He who is able to kneel before the Eucharist, who receives the Lord's body, cannot fail to be attentive in daily life to situations unworthy of man, and is able to bend down personally to attend to need, is able to break his bread with the hungry, share water with the thirsty, clothe the naked, and visit the sick and the imprisoned. So when we kneel before Jesus in the Eucharist, it helps us become more compassionate to others, and it helps us practice like bending down towards other people's needs. So just to conclude, once again, kneeling and worship are inseparable. They're two parts of one thing, the external and the internal, and it is really important. This is a very Christian thing to do. It is from our ancestors, all the way from Jesus himself. And so when we come to Mass, when we kneel down and pray, we should think about how important this act is and what it means, and how it helps us to be more like Jesus and to love others and to love